All right, I have another video for you, and today we're going to be responding to a TikToker who is a non-Calvinist, TikTok non-Calvinist. I will be responding to, and this was fun. This video was very interesting, and you'll see that he just simply does not like Calvinists. You will see that he just simply does not like Calvinists. He is not the system. It's a combination, I guess, the system and the people that hold to Calvinism. So this individual is quite illicit with his hatred towards Calvinism. But before we get into that, make sure you know to subscribe to the Gospel Truth and hit that notification bell so you don't miss out on any shows, interviews, commentaries, or debates coming up here in the future. All right. With that said, let's get into this video.
Our dear friend here is asking if I'm a Calvinist, and the answer is no. No, I'm not a Calvinist. For those of you who don't know what Calvinism is, there was a dude named Jacobus Arminius who was a student of Calvin a couple hundred years back.
Well, he's already wrong. Jacob Arminius was not a student of Calvin. Calvin was born in 1509 and he died in 1564. Jacob Arminius wasn't born until 1560, right? So that would mean that Jacob Arminius was 4 years old when Calvin died. And obviously at 4 years old, Jacob Arminius wasn't anybody's student at that point, except for his parents, at the very least, right? And so he's already off on the wrong foot. He needs to brush up on his church history a little bit and know when people are born, because that's an inaccurate statement by this individual. But let's continue to see what he has to say.
John Calvin was a preacher, and he came up with a doctrine. And the hilarious thing is they're big on...
Well, John Calvin was more than a preacher. He was a theologian, and many of the doctrines that we hold to today came about by the help of John Calvin. Many attest that John Calvin, many non-Calvinists and Calvinists alike, attest that John Calvin played a huge factor in the growth of theology and the desire to grow in theology and knowing God. And that's what theology is, right? It's basically the understanding and of knowing God, right? And so many people, Calvinists or non-Calvinists, do give John Calvin credit in that because of his hunger for the word of God and his thirst and desire to grow in the knowledge of God, he basically been the example for many to continue to grow in their knowledge of God. And that this is not, and that's why John Calvin is more than just a preacher or a pastor or a preacher. He's a theologian, and he's done a lot in the Christian paradigm as far as developing of the doctrine and being an example of how theologians should behave and act towards the studying of God's word.
Like saying, we don't tolerate private revelations to individuals, right? But that's kind of what Calvinism is, right? It's like...
No, it's not actually. The private revelation has to do with one person sitting inside of his room or corner of his room at his desk or whatever, and coming up with his own interpretations. That's just simply not how things went. Once again, John Calvin did not create the tulip. He did not create the doctrines of grace. These doctrines were created from individuals who follow Calvin, but they were created later in a response to the Arminians or the Remonstrants of that time, right? If you want to get more into it, you can go ahead and read about the Synod of Dort, and that sort of will give you a purview of what was the contention going on. The understanding is that the Arminians of the time, or the Remonstrants, were protesting these doctrines. They were upset about these doctrines, and there was a big hoopla about this, right? There was a big discussion concerning these doctrines, and so the Remonstrants gave their concerns. Then in response to the Remonstrants, the Reformed thinkers, they responded to that, right? They responded to that and put the doctrines of grace in sort of an acrostic and responded to what the Remonstrants or the Arminians of the time were saying. And so that's what it was. It wasn't John Calvin sitting in this corner getting a private interpretation and just coming up with this stuff, right? A lot of this stuff happened after John Calvin died. And so once again, this individual really needs to brush up on his church history. He really has it wrong.
A couple 100-year-old private interpretation by one guy. And they'll be like, that's not true.
Yeah, and he's about to go, that's not true, because it's not true. right? It's not true that it was a private interpretation by one guy. Once again, theology is always developed by multiple people throughout the years church history. This makes you think about the Trinity, right? The Trinity didn't just come up one day and boom, bam, kazam, right? It was a development over time, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong for the theology to develop over time. In fact, the understanding of total depravity, which is the T in the acrostic of Calvinism, of the doctrines of grace, the T can be said to be argued all the way back to the 4th century, right? Remember, Calvin, he didn't really come on the scene until the 1500s, the 16th century. But it is said that the argumentation and the concerns, that the debates and the conversation concerning total depravity can be rooted all the way back to the 4th century. And so this is something that's actually been in development way prior to what we see, what we have, what we think it came about, right? And when we think the development of the tulip acrostic, the doctrines of grace was developed. And so, take that for what it's worth, but nonetheless, it was not a private interpretation. It was not someone sitting in a corner doing this stuff.
If you go back, it goes all the way back to him and him and him, and it goes all the way back, and they start sounding Catholic real quick with the papal secession type stuff.
That's funny. A lot of these individuals who left a lot of people who developed these doctrines and theology did leave the Catholic Church. So I'm sure some of that residual was definitely there. But once again, there's nothing wrong for development. There's nothing wrong with carrying over certain things that are biblically sound, right? There's nothing wrong with conveying a teaching that is in line with Scripture. And so, once again, he's blowing smoke as of right now, and he's not really being accurate in the proper representation of what actually the historical nature of Calvinism and what Calvinism is all about.
And they'll get pissed if you say anything like that. They don't like that at all.
Well, not really. We won't get mad or pissed or upset about it. It's just a matter of proper representation, right? I mean, we can treat each other unfairly, but it does nothing but make you look like a fool, right? So, I mean, that's the important thing about proper representation. We don't want to be foolish in our representation. We want to make sure we're treating people accurately and fairly as we interact with these things.
They are hyper grace people, and I'm a big fan of that because we are saved by grace through faith, not works, but for works.
All right, be careful with the hyper grace, though, sir. You might want to be very careful because there's two understandings of hyper grace, right? You have this hyper grace where individuals definitely rely on grace. They really have a concentrated focus on grace, and I would say that the Calvinist does. We understand that we're saved by grace through faith, saved by grace through faith, and so yes, there is this emphasis on God's grace being on us, right? It was because of God's grace that we are saved. It's not any works that we have done that saved us. It is all by God's grace. But we want to be careful with that. By saying hyper grace, many people would interpret that as being antinomianism. Anti meaning against, and nomen meaning the law. So meaning being against the law. What antinomianism teaches is this idea of almost like there's no expectation by God of his people obeying a law. Like, God doesn't expect his people being able to obey the moral law. So in other words, people who are hyper grace or free gracers, are another name for it, are antinomians. These individuals tend to have an understanding of grace where it's just superimposed. It's an exaggerated hyperbolic level of faith, of grace, to where there's no need to even follow the moral law. Right. I remember hosting a debate, and one of the individuals who was a free gracer was asked a question, hey, can a Christian be a homosexual? And he gladly said yes, without hesitation. And so that is the downfall of this level of hyper grace. Now, once again, the Calvinist does have a very sincere level of understanding and appreciation for the grace of God, more so than a lot of these evangelicals out there. But I would say that the Calvinist does put up a barrier, though, that there's a limit of how far we're willing to take that grace. We do not view grace in this idea that we can go out there and sin flippantly and loosely and treat God's word loose and disregard God's law. No, the Calvinists would say that we have an appreciation for grace, and thus is because of that grace and because of that love that God has shown to us that we live our lives according to his law. But like, we want to live out what he has done for us, right? So if he's been good to us, we want to appreciate that goodness by living out what he's called us not to do, right? The things that he's called us to stay away from, we want to stay away from those things, right? We don't want to cheat on our wives. We don't want to live promiscuously. We don't want to be fornicators. We don't want to do these things, right? We want to be humble servants for the Lord. And a part of that, obviously, is our behavior towards the Lord. It's the way we act, the way we carry ourselves on a day-to-day basis. So it's not this idea of having hyper grace. We're not hyper grace in that sense of the word. We have appreciation of grace, but we're certainly not antinomians by any stretch of the imagination.
But for a bunch of people who claim to be saved by grace, they have zero grace for anyone else. If you disagree at all with them, they just shun you from their boys' club.
And that's true and not true. Yes, there are Calvinists out there who are really mean. I've run into several of them who have a really mean spirit. They can be really rigid and hard and abrasive. But a vast majority of the Calvinists that I've met and I know, whether online or in person, have a very loving heart for the Lord, and they will serve you till the cows come home. They will love on you till the cows come home. They will be, they would take the shirt off their back. They will give you the shoes off their feet, of the Calvinists that I've experienced. And so, yes, there are Calvinists out there who are very headstrong, very assertive, very aggressive, very rigid, and very abrasive. But I would say that is that's the minority. I do believe that many Calvinists, more Calvinists than not, are very loving and very sincere in their belief, and they express that love as well, right? They just happen to be theological nerds, right? And sometimes theological nerds can be, can sort of give you that cringe feel a little bit, but nonetheless, they definitely love their love. And this is spilling back into this idea of, because God loved us, we are to express that love to others. And that's where we get this idea of why I feel that Calvinists do love, right? We reject the idea of being able to live any old way we want to, and just saying, oh, look, see, I'm saved, and have this idea of antinomianism, like living like as if that matters. No, we're not in that camp at all.
I don't like the lack of love in the community. I don't think they have. It's just like the charismatics that have the gifts but no character. They have the 9 gifts of the Spirit, but none of the 9 fruit of the Spirit. The Calvinists don't either. They don't have the character of Christ. They shun people very quickly. They're very belligerent in the way that it's a boys' club, and I really don't.
And that's completely unfair to say, right? That's completely unfair to say. There could be this attitude of there being sort of this quote unquote boys club in some camps of Calvinism, but that certainly is not the case in the majority camp. And this is the sad part of what this individual is saying, is that he's sort of broad brushing all Calvinists into a lump sum, right? He's broad brushing. There's this understanding. Calvinism is monolithic, right? We all don't believe the same. We all don't behave the same. And so we have to give that ability. We have to allow that, right? We have to allow that level of grace, speaking of grace, to be there, right? And so it's not this idea that we don't have character. Certainly many Calvinists have a lot of character, right? And they love Jesus. They want to serve Jesus. They want to be more like Jesus every single day. So this individual is just totally misrepresenting. He's broad brushing, aggressively broad brushing, and bringing all Calvinists into one lump sum and not giving individual Calvinists a fair shake.
Now, they believe in something called tulip, and this was something that Jacobus Arminius kind of threw at Calvin.
Once again, that's false, because Jacob Arminius was not even 5 years old during the time when John Calvin died. So Jacob Arminius didn't throw anything at Calvin, right? Because once again, Jacob Arminius was a kid, a little baby, 4 years old out of the womb. And so this individual don't know what he's talking about, and it's clearly seeing that this is all a big ball of emotion, right? This is not something that he sat down and really went through the scriptures with to see if the Bible teaches Calvinism or the doctrines of grace. This is all emotional jumbo jam, right? This is all emotional hogwash, if I could say that, all emotional hogwash.
As a list of implications or a list of grievances, he said, for this.
Now, it wasn't Jacob Arminius that did that, right? It was probably his students that did that, right? I mean, he developed it later on, right? And so Yes, there was a list of grievances, and this is why those who came after John Calvin, who were students of John Calvin, put the acoustic tulip in place, was as a response to the contention, right? And so once again, this is not Jacob Arminius giving anything to John Calvin, because once again, John Calvin was dead and gone by the time Jacob Arminius got up of age to even contend for these issues, right?
To be the case, the way you're teaching, we would have to be totally depraved, and there's a little bit spark of humanity, goodness in humanity. And I disagree. I think that we're pretty depraved, pretty totally depraved.
Oh wow, we agree. We agree. He believes in total depravity, but it's just one thing he agrees with.
But Calvin takes it so far to say that you're so totally depraved you would never choose to be saved. Therefore, there's zero free will. We're basically robots. And then Calvinists are like, no, it's not that we're robots. It's just that you have such limited free will that blah blah blah. And it's like,
Well, you can tell this individual just really doesn't understand what's being said here. Is the will of man is in bondage, right? So you have free will. You have a free will, but your free will is only constrained to that you're enslaved to, right? And so there is not this idea that we reject the idea of free will. We just reject the idea of libertarian free will, where you can do basically anything according to your nature. And so that's where we say, nope, that is a problem, where the individual is definitely in bondage to their sin. And so that will of man is constrained to that bondage, and it's only by God's grace that you are set free. You can actually do the things that that align with God, like things that God would desire for you to do. As far as one example is being saved, right? Coming to Christ. Your freedom is not freed until you are delivered, until the chains are broken, until your heart is changed and your heart is made new.
They get, they're basically legalists, kind of like they're arguing points. They're becoming contentious about the details. They take the verses and the epistles and load them up like a gun and start shooting them at each other like it's a battle.
Well, we're definitely not legalists by any stretch, right? Once again, we're saved by grace, right? Not even the works of ourselves, right? We're saved by grace through faith. And so therefore, we're not legalists. We're the least legal, if anything, right? Yes, we have a lot of theological doctrines. Yes, we have a lot of things we stand on, a lot of things we believe the Bible is teaching, but that doesn't make us legalists. Non-Calvinists alike also have things that they believe in, or they hold very stringently to, and they're not willing to budge on those theological positions. And so it's not just a Calvinist thing that they hold to theological truths in a rigid manner. And it's certainly, so we can't be called legalists because we rely on grace, right? We're saved by grace through faith. That's like totally the opposite of being a legalist. And so if you understand Calvinism, you understand that just simply is the case, right? That just simply is the case, that we're not legalists. And by definition, what we hold to, Calvinists hold to, you can't conflate that to legalism.
And I'm just like, guys, it's not a formula, it's a relationship. It's not a list of things, it's a person you have to know.
Well, because we know Jesus doesn't mean we can't deal in theology and say like the doctrine of the Trinity is true and thus it is a salvific issue. Because Calvinists and non-Calvinists alike would agree that if you reject the Trinity, then you are in danger of hellfire, right? And so this, once again, we have theological concepts and things that came up in church history that we hold to today, and there's nothing wrong with holding on to these things, while all at the same time understanding that we do have a relationship with Jesus Christ. There's nothing wrong. It's because of that relationship with Jesus Christ, which causes us to desire to hold to correct doctrine. Obviously, Calvinists and non-Calvinists alike, Calvinists and non-Calvinists have a difference in many different sort of peripheral issues as far as doctrine is concerned, in some cases anyway. But that doesn't mean that we don't disregard the notion of holding fast to Jesus Christ in our theological emphasis.
And they're just cold and calculated, and they just, like, I don't like them.
See the personal appetite there? They're just cold and calculated, and I just don't like them. And so this drills us all the way back to the beginning of this video, how this individual seemed to have this almost emotional response. It's not really something that he dove into. This is not something he really spent a lot of time in to really properly and give a fair critique of Calvinism. This is just this individual jumping the gun once again and having an emotional response. That's all this is. And this is par for the course, right? In many situations where non-Calvinists do respond, they don't deal honestly and fairly with what's being said, what Calvinism teaches. They give more emotional responses. Says, well, I just don't like Calvinists, or I just don't like Calvinism. I don't like what it says. Like, okay, fair enough, but is it biblical? Right? Are you going to dive into it to see if it's biblical? Right? And so this is once again a very, very bad, very bad take by another anti-Calvinist.
They're arrogant and intellectual, and we're supposed to be reading the Bible like children, not scholars.
It's true that some Calvinists can be arrogant and they can be prideful. They could be unhumble, things like that. Sure, but once again, that goes for non-Calvinists as well. This is just not a Calvinist thing. And so, but a majority of Calvinists, I would say, don't have that kind of attitude, right? Being a sinner, being one who is under God's grace. Yes, we fall and we fumble, we mess up. And there are times where we can be unhumble, right? And be prideful, but more times than not, I do believe that the Calvinists, many that I've encountered, do desire to be humble, do desire to be to show grace, do desire to be individual who loves relationships with other people. So this is once again a broad brushing extreme here.
Fancy themselves smart. They think they've got it all figured out. There's no room for any humility at all because everything makes sense in their systematic theology. But my biggest gripe is that they're cowards, and it's all based in fear. They're afraid to leave the vessel with the basket of bread and walk out into the waves of the spiritual world to follow Christ. They stay with what they can intellectualize, and they're afraid of the spiritual walk.
This is just not true. Many of the Calvinists throughout history have led abolitionist movements, right? Right now we have many Calvinists, more than not, who are leading the abolishment of abortion. We have many Calvinists in the past who led the abolishment of slavery. So it's not this idea that we like to sit in our corner, we like to sit in our pew and not go out into the world, and we're afraid, we're cowards, we're scared. Not at all. Many of the Reformed thinkers were the ones who got burned at the stake because they stood up against the Roman Catholic Church. No, this is just a horrible characteristic of who Calvinists are historically and present day. And so once again, this is another emotional response by an anti-Calvinist, and they are, like you said, like you see the sign there, this one is from TikTok. But I hope you enjoyed this video, and I pray that you'll make sure you subscribe and like this video, share, do everything you know you're supposed to do. All right. Hopefully you'll be with me next time when I make another video. All right. Take care. God bless.